clarinet playing from reading about your experience earlier,
Mm,
and your recorder playing, of course, as well.
right,
Um,
right. So
do, do, you- do,
I started off playing the recorder when I was very, very
mhm.
little. I was about 3 or 4 years old, found my brother's recorder and got hold of that. And then I found in our loft these Irish wooden, they're not, they're sort of fife, I think it's called. So
Oh, sure, yeah.
there's these little Irish wooden fifes.
Hmm.
So again, I wasn't even at school, I think, at that point, and I found them. And one of them played really nice. It was in really great condition and loved it. I mean, that was just like, I have found my thing here.
Mm, really?
Um, and then in the UK, way back then, so this is pre-Margaret Thatcher's days,
Mm.
all children were offered music lessons for
Was it in
free
school or
in
was
the
it?
school. So
Gotcha.
peripatetic teachers would come for all the different instruments, and we had a choice of instrument, and the only obligation we had was to play in the school orchestra.
Mm.
So of course my immediate was sign me up for flute.
Mm.
And my mother said flute's a whiffly waffly instrument. She didn't like that at all and signed me up for clarinet.
I see. Okay, that's maybe a familiar experience for a lot of us, actually, that
Yeah.
we have one dream and our parents kind of get us like dream adjacent, if not not quite to the dream.
I have this secret feeling that I think my mother was in love with Acapulco.
Oh,
And I think that was why I got signed up for clarinet lessons.
Oh, gotcha. Well, like as a parent now myself, I feel like I can have some sympathy for, you want your kids to do things, but you also kind of want them to be things that you like,
Yeah, yeah,
makes
yeah.
it easier.
Yeah, right. I think it's one of the real hard things about being a parent, actually, is to, and I talk in my work about attunement. I think it's really hard
Hmm.
as parents to actually be able to let go of our dreams, our expectations, our values, and just say, yes, I have a role in educating my child. Of course I do. But I think that's educating them in things like emotional intelligence, social intelligence, life skills. But I also need to be really attuned to who they are as they don't belong to me. My child belongs to his or
Yeah.
herself.
Yeah.
And just to be really attuned to who is this being before me? And what is it that flows through them and somehow to enable them to be that they are.
That hits pretty squarely for me. I have to remind myself all the time, like I call them my kid, right?
Right.
Oh, but they're their own person.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting to me that like your practices, your exercises, like for attunement, for example, I like the way you're talking about it right now, how this is like something that's very applicable to a lot of aspects of a person's life.
Mm-hmm.
This I feel like is maybe this is the experience for everybody who comes to your work, that like it's at first a little bit surprising
Mm-hmm.
how much it's like, no, I'm here to work on my fingers.
Yeah.
Like, why are you
Right.
talking about all this other stuff? Like I want my fingers to work right.
Right.
And I really like, actually, in your book, The Focal Dystonia Cure, you mention, I have the quote written down here because I wanted to get it right, where you said that we were headed, sorry, one sec. Here it is. You say, nope, I have so many quotes here and I didn't write down that one. Nope. But it's where you say that in order to understand what's going on with dystonia, we need to go to a different part of our brain. And you say that it's a part that is accessed by metaphor.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
I mean, of course,
Yeah.
it's a thing that comes up for you all the time, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I love metaphors anyway. I feel like storytelling is the only way that I understand anything at all. And so I was wondering if you might maybe, because like I don't want to just be so boring, Ruth, and ask you exactly the same things every other person would ever ask you. Things that anybody can read your book or Google, and I hope they will. There'll be links to your book in the show notes. But I was curious if, when it comes to metaphor, if you've in working with other people as well as experiencing focal dystonia yourself, if you've come across any really apt metaphors to describe what it feels like to deal with dystonia, maybe using metaphor. And I guess the reason I thought of that is just because of like the metaphor you've used before about dominoes, where you talk about how like when dominoes tip over, maybe the last one that tips over is your dystonia, with your embouchure with your fingers.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the first one. Like something knocked that over and something knocked that over and something knocked that over. And that kind of metaphor is what helps me go, oh, I see what she's talking about. I see why she's talking about attunement, right?
Yes.
To get to my fingers. We're working kind of backward to a root cause kind of thing.
Yeah.
So now I'm rambling because I'm nervous. Sorry, Ruth. What have you encountered any good metaphors to describe what it's like to work with dystonia, to have dystonia?
I think everyone has their own personal experience of what dystonia is and what it feels like. I think there are two very common metaphors. One would be the direct experience of the dystonia, and the other would be what I believe is the experience that we start to have when we're further along the road of releasing it. So the first metaphor is it's about being knotted up. There's something very tightly wound up and knotted together inside. And so in a way, what we're doing with the dystonia is unwinding all those strings.
That makes sense. That makes me think of when you talked with Victor Wooten, which I just love everything Victor Wooten has ever done.
He's amazing.
And he talked about how at first he thought it was a problem with his hands. He had it happening in both of his hands. And he talked about how like he then, as he was working through some of your methods, he started to realize there was tension in his face, in his arms, in his shoulders. And he realized that like his breath was stuck, I think is the way that he said it, that his breath would get like stuck up high in his lungs. That feels very, very much like the experience of being knotted up to me as I hear you describe that.
Yeah. And then the other metaphor, I think, and I've actually got a new book coming out this summer as well.
Oh, exciting.
So it's not on focal dystonia on its own. It's actually on performance blocks in general. For me, focal dystonia is an extreme somatization of performance blocks, but it comes out in so many other ways as well. And it could be applied to any type of performance, but I have written it very specifically for musicians, this book. But, any performer in any field of performance could actually use the same... they would just change the word, musical instrument for whatever it might be their field. And this is the metaphor that I've used in the new book, is getting a long way away from home, having ventured away a long way from home. So what do I mean by that? If we come back to the idea of attunement, if I'm lucky enough to have had adults around me who have been sufficiently attuned, they don't have to be perfectly attuned to me, but sufficiently attuned to me, I can stay in myself because they've come to me and they've attuned to me, who I am, so I can stay in myself and begin to relate to myself and relate to the world around me from who I am. If I haven't had that good fortune, then I have to come out of myself in order to relate to the world. And remember, this is maybe happening right from in utero. It's certainly happening for many of us from the first days of our life, where being attuned to is a life and death issue for a baby, because as babies, we're completely vulnerable.
Yeah.
Okay, completely defenseless. So my life is, the brain, particularly the early brain, doesn't understand that we're living in a modern society where we have, our house with locks on it and nobody's going to, and we have plentiful food and plentiful warmth. The brain baby's brain doesn't understand that. Baby's brain is still in the wild, where I have to be in the constant remembrance of my carers in order to ensure that a predator doesn't pick me off, in order to ensure that I'm kept warm and dry, or cool if I'm living in a very hot place, and to remember to feed me. So if my carers are unable to keep me on their radar, I have to put myself in their radar.
I'm immediately thinking of my own almost 9-month-old baby last night. Every time he would cry, he was putting himself on my radar, wasn't he?
Right.
He was getting my attention.
Yeah. So what does that mean? If I've had from very early in my life a lack of attunement. And I'm really not coming from a place of judgment or blame from our parents' perspective, because as a parent, unless I've done a lot of personal development work for myself, I'm going to attune to my children in the same measure that I was attuned to. I can't provide something that I haven't received. And then there are many, many reasons why I may not be able to be in that attuned relationship with my child. I mean, we live in a society where the level of stress is very high, where, many parents are in a state of survival for whatever reason that might be. And when I'm in survival, my limbic system is shut down, and therefore I'm unable to attune to and resonate with other people who are around me. Okay. So I really wanted to be clear that there is no judgment, but there is a truth here that if I haven't been attuned to and I haven't had the experience, then I'm going to move out of myself in order to stay on the radar of the people who are taking care of me. And so what I'm doing is I'm going to be learning all sorts of adaptations in myself in order to stay on their radar. And I have forgotten who I am. And so I've already begun from probably very early on in life to come a long way away from home.
I see that the metaphor is making sense. Okay. And so then is the journey then to the metaphorical journey then to figure your way out back home.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there a title for the book already?
It's called Free to Perform.
Oh, that sounds excellent. Sounds like a very efficient way to put down. I mean, like as a musician myself, I think to myself, I would like that. I mean, I get nervous and get stage fright, and people turn to me when it's time for me to solo, and I lock up. I'd like to feel more free. That would be nice.
Right. And that was the idea. That was the idea of the book. So it builds on some of the concepts that I've put in the Focal Dystonia cure. But I talk a lot more about the adaptations that we create in ourselves as a result of that lack of attunement, and how that becomes knotted up. There's adaptations become knotted up inside of ourselves, and then the book gives that whole theoretical part. It also gives a very descriptive part of what this feels like on the inside. And in the same way with the Focal Dystonia cure, I tried to be very descriptive. I didn't want it just to be some kind of intellectual exercise. I wanted to be able to I want to really to be able to describe what it's like when our nervous system is in survival, so that as I read that, I go, wow, that's what's going on inside of me. And I just thought that was normal because I've lived with that my whole life.
Yeah.
Right. And then these really practical brain spotting exercises, which enable us to take the journey home.
I see. So it's interesting to me that like you talk about, like just now you mentioned like how some of these things might be embedded all the way back to our infancy. And I don't know, I want to kind of like connect some dots where I'm trying to remember which dots weren't connected for me when I first started looking at your work, in order to kind of like maybe if some of my listeners aren't aware of your work yet, to kind of like help them bring these things together clearly. I know that like maybe starting with that last domino, right? With like the manifestation of dystonia, which for you, actually, maybe you could tell me a little bit, if you don't mind kind of recapping a little bit. You didn't experience dystonia in your fingers. You had the embouchure dystonia.
Embouchure, yeah.
And that was when playing clarinet specifically, right?
That was when playing clarinet specifically. Although when I first began to play flute, I really noticed that I mean, it was different, but I couldn't I didn't have a really adequate, I don't want to use the word control because I don't think we control the body when we're playing, but I didn't have an adequate sensitivity in my embouchure. So, I felt like I had worked through enough to be able to come back to music, picked up the flute, and I found the flute, I mean, the flute's a very difficult instrument anyway, but I found it difficult because of the lack of sensitivity in my embouchure. So then I continued to do my brain spotting in order to bring whatever was going on in my tongue and my mouth, right back into being really harmonious. So, but before the dystonia, I started to have very serious anxiety and panic attacks with the musical instrument.
Yeah, when I first encountered you describing it that way, that you said that like you realized that the dystonia was a part of this bigger. I wouldn't have realized this bigger ball of like, would you say symptoms or experiences that included panic attacks, anxiety, stage fright, etc. That was eye opening to me. I hadn't thought of that before.
Yeah.
And I feel kind of self-conscious about this too, Ruth, because I don't think I've ever experienced focal dystonia. And so I another thing that Victor Wooten mentioned was that when he first started looking around the forums and stuff, like first kind of realized that he might have focal dystonia, he encountered a lot of he described it as hostility. And he suggested maybe it's because of fear around focal dystonia. I don't want to contribute to any sense of hostility, but I will admit freely that I'm terrified of it. I'm terrified of it for my own sake, and I feel like anxiously stressed about like finding a solution for my friends, because I feel so deeply for them, and I watch them try to get their hands in the cases of my friends, it's always the hands that's manifesting for my friends, try to get their hands to do what they used to do, and just even just imagining how frustrating that is freaks me out. But if that last domino is, like realizing that you didn't have great sensitivity for the flute, or that air is leaking around the clarinet.
Exactly. For me, in terms of the clarinet, but this is the make or break. This is the bit that stopped me playing. That's not to say there weren't things going on beforehand. So the bit that stopped me playing was I couldn't control the corner of my mouth any longer. It's like the muscle went into, just had no strength in it. So the air would escape out the corner of my lip. So no air would go through the instrument. So I literally could not play a note.
Gotcha. That's interesting that there's a violin player. His name is Joaquin Farias, who he talked about it in his hands, about how I think it was his left ring finger, just like maybe in a similar way that your mouth just like wouldn't close. He said when he first noticed it, it was just falling. It would just suddenly unexpectedly fall onto his fingerboard.
Yes.
And I think of my friends who I've watched experiencing it, like my friend Sean, who was our bagpipe pipe major for a long time. You know how the bagpipe melody part is what we call the chanter, and you have a thumb on the back and then your fingers on the front. It seemed like for him, rather than things losing strength, it was balling up, And so like he'd be trying to play. In fact, Victor Wooten, sorry to talk about Victor so much, how can anyone help it? What an amazing person, right?
Right.
He talked about how like when it got really bad, his fret hand would like tighten up that so badly that he would like pop off of his bass neck. Like it would just like pop back and just be like balled up. And that's what it looked like was happening to Sean. He'd be playing, and as he was playing, he'd be trying to control it, and his fingers would eventually pop off of the chanter. And so is there any way to figure out why it would manifest as a loss of strength versus like a tightening up with the mouth or with the hands?
There is an explanation, but I think there's something more valuable that could come out of your description.
Sorry that I keep rambling, Ruth. You're just such a qualified person. I feel so nervous.
But it's brilliant because it's through the conversation that such richness can come out. Because if we want to talk, if we go right back to that beginning where we talked about metaphor rather than logic, it's through the richness of this conversation that quality comes out. Otherwise, we'd just have this really boring conversation where I just talk about neuroscience and
brains.
I don't think that and brain stuff, and I think that would be interesting for anybody. So this is I love these types of conversations. I think it's where the richness is. So let's think of this as being the nervous system being in survival. So when our nervous system is in survival, there are a number of things that are happening in the brain, such as the area of the brain that controls fine motor skills is being inhibited, and our ability to connect with other people is being inhibited. But there's something else that's very important that's happening, which is the brain stem and the very deepest part of the brain is preparing the body to either be in fight, to be in flight, which are what we might call a hyperactivation of the nervous system, or it will put the nervous system into a hypoactivation, which is freeze, collapse, or fawning.
Okay, I see already how, yeah.
Okay, so, and we can't govern really the way our nervous system is going to respond. So it's very complex and a very complex organization of all our life experiences to whether my nervous system, its natural response is to go into fight. The clenching of the fist is fight. So that kind of pulling in, it is more of a fight response in the body. Whereas what was going on in my body was a collapse response. And I know throughout the whole of my life that when I'm under stress, I'm more likely to go into collapse than I am to go into fight or flight.
I see.
In all sorts of situations. What might collapse it look like? It might be that feeling of giving up, it's useless, like there's, I can't do this, or feeling really sad about things. I'm more likely to feel sad when somebody hurts me than angry at them. Right.
Yeah.
So
when I read your description of those two in the book, I definitely identified strongly with that one. I was like, oh yeah. I often just want the release of just disappearing when I'm stressed. That's for sure.
Yes. Yeah. But what's really important that's going on here is that there were so many things I didn't put in the book just because I didn't want to get people too much down a rabbit hole. Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
But we have something that's called fascia that runs through the body. Okay, so the fascia is, we know, any of us who and vegetarians might not know this, but any of us who eat meat know that when we take the skin off a chicken, there's that kind of very thin membrane.
Yeah. That's
the fascia. Okay, now the fascia is around the muscle. It's like a bag that's around the muscle that holds the body. I mean, it's in our organs as well. It's not just in the muscles. But I'm talking about muscles here because of the relevance for what we're talking about with the focal dystonia. It also runs right through the muscles. So if you think of a mandarin or a satsuma, when you open that, there's like the skin around the segment. But actually, when you open the segment, it has all those sort of little grains in it that have bits of skin around it as well, right? Or membrane around it. That's what the fascia is like running through our muscles. Contains something very similar to smooth muscle. What does that mean? Skeletal muscle, which is what we think of as, our muscles in our body that hold the body and create movement, they're under our voluntary control. We have no voluntary control over smooth muscle. So that's the muscles that are in our digestive system and in anything that's happening involuntary. It's very similar to the cardiac muscle as well, which is a slightly different type of involuntary muscle. What does that mean? That means that the fascia is directly linked into the survival part of our brain, so that when we feel under threat, it will contract. Or it will certainly be pre-preparing the muscles to take action. And we cannot control that. It's completely involuntary. And we all know that, because if a ball was suddenly to come flying towards you, you would bring your hand up or you would move your head away, and that will have happened without you being able to do anything about it. Yeah.
It would be an automatic, not a controlled kind of response. So that's kind of the system. That system is like taking over or influencing what's going on.
Yeah.
I feel like that's making so much sense, that like just the little windows that I have into it. I mean, it's like, it's not always what I would have thought of as like a negative experience, like it might be exciting to be getting ready to play a parade or to go to a rehearsal session with the band or by oneself, to sit down to practice, or to perform on a stage. You might think of that as being fun, but I feel like, well, maybe I'm drawing a conclusion that doesn't need to be drawn, because I'm just thinking of my friends who have focal dystonia and how, like, well, of course that's where you see it, because they're going to have it in relationship to their instrument, and that's when they get their instrument out. So maybe I'm drawing too much of a conclusion, but I'm just thinking like, that's kind of like when the tensing up kind of happens. And I've heard before, Ruth, that like I heard a piano player once describe that when that happened to them, they would anytime they sat down at a piano, they were fine. They could type on a computer and stuff like that. They could do similar movements, but it was when they sat at a piano and reached out to touch the keys, that's when their fingers would, they actually had the person who was talking had the thing where some fingers would ball up and some would go straight.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And they said that it happened when they were playing on ivory keys, which is typical or imitation ivory keys of like fancy pianos. But when they were at a cheap piano that had plastic keys, it actually at least took longer to appear.
Okay.
It's like there was this change. What's going on there? It surprises me.
So what I think is really going on here is, and this is why I think this is why people are very frightened about focal dystonia and get very stressed about it, and why we're often working in the wrong place to release the focal dystonia is because we think it's only happening in those moments, right?
Yeah.
I believe it's happening all of the time, but we're not aware of it. So what do I mean by that? Our brain is constantly gating information in or gating information out, right, of our conscious part of our brain. So.
Right.
And why does it need to do that? One of the reasons why it needs to do that is that the subconscious part of the brain is working at 11 million bits of information, and only per second, rather, and only 40 of those can come up into the conscious part of the brain because it works very slowly. So it has to gate everything else out.
Yeah,
right?
couldn't handle all of it at the same time.
Couldn't handle all of that.
Got to pick and choose.
And we know that, after you've been sitting on a chair for some time, you no longer feel it underneath your seat.
Yeah.
And then when somebody tells you about it again, you can suddenly feel the contact between the chair and your body.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? So that's a classic of the gating system. But we also gate out information that's too overwhelming for our conscious brain. So you'll remember from the book that I talk a lot about dissociation. We've disconnected from a lot of what is happening in our body. And you've already talked about Victor, that he realized after we started to work together and we started to lower his sensory gate, that he started to aware there's so much more happening than just my fingers. The closer that's happening to the center of the body, the more leverage it has in terms of releasing the dystonia. Okay, so what we're remembering is what's going on in my fingers is the last domino to fall. So if we think of that in terms of a chain, that's a long way away from the cause. So if I'm working, if I get over obsessed with my fingers and think that's where I want to be doing, that's what I want to be controlling, that's what I want to be healing, that's where I want to be placing my attention, it's like trying to open the door by pushing it from the hinges. There's no leverage there. Yeah. We might get there eventually, but it'd probably take us 10, 20 years. Whereas if we can work on what's going on in the center of the body, then that's opening the door from the handle. From the handle side of the door.
That's actually going to make a difference and make sense.
Yes, because what's happening is my system is constantly running some kind of survival program, but all of the time. Not just when I sit down to play the piano or play my music, in this case of the person you're talking about here.
Yeah.
My nervous system is actually running a survival mode constantly. It may be very obvious, and I work with people who have very high levels of anxiety all of the time when right from the outset when they're working with me. I work with other people that aren't so aware of it. They think that they are, very dynamic, very kind of functional people. But when we actually start to bring the sensory gate down and they really start to connect to themselves, they will go, no, I'm constantly breath holding throughout my day. Or I do have this kind of constant sort of a tension in my abdomen, or a constant tension in my shoulders, or a constant tightening of my throat, whatever it might be. And that is there with them constantly, but they've become so used to it that they're no longer aware of it.
Oh, so, yeah. I mean, it might have been there for decades, right? Like their whole life.
Like their whole life. Yeah. And so, and the closer it is into the center of the body, the more it is directly linked into the survival patterns. So what we're looking to do really, I mean, in a way, if I was to summarize what I describe within the focal dystonia cure, is first of all, I'm showing you how to lower the sensory gate, which is the attunement exercise, and really get connected to everything that's going on. And then I'm teaching you how to bring the nervous system into well-being, which is the zero state and the kindness state exercise. So the nervous system can actually start to run in safe mode. Then from there, we actually start to become aware of all the holding patterns that I have in my body to do with my survival state. And as we release those, and as I say, we're working mainly on the center of the body with that rather than on the hands. As we forget about the musical instrument, forget about what's happening in my hands and my embouchure or my foot or wherever it is, and I just come back into the really understanding the way that I hold survival in my body, and I can use the brain spotting to release that, then the fascia is not just in my fingers, the fascia runs right through the whole of my body. The fascia just releases. It doesn't need to be in that pre-prepared
Constantly
tension,
tightened up.
constantly tightened up, completely releases. And where I was presenting the dystonia in my body becomes released as well. It just doesn't do it any longer.
That fascia throughout the whole body thing is so interesting to me because I feel like a lot of the people who I've heard or read describing dystonia at some point mention that they had something in their head, like on top of their head, which like doesn't feel like a muscle group that I usually have control over. And so it feels like once they recognize tension in a place that they don't like consciously contract, I feel like that must be a fascia thing, I would imagine.
Right.
And it's so interesting to me too that Ruth, what you're describing in like not focusing on the fingertips or the embouchure is the opposite of what we would instinctively do when we first start having this problem, right? Wouldn't we all think, oh, I need to practice more. I need to focus in really tight on that left ring finger that's giving me trouble. Like our tunnel vision on that thing really zooms in. And are we making it worse by doing that, or at least not helping? What do you think?
I think it's all part of the dystonia, because I don't think the dystonia is just in the body. So when I was talking earlier about the adaptations. So as performers, we have a number of gifts. Okay. One of our gifts is that we have a very high level of attunement. Another of our gifts is that we know how to be disciplined and constant, or we learn how to be disciplined and constant. You know, learning a musical instrument is many, many, many hours of practice.
Yeah.
We learn how to have determination and resilience, because otherwise, when something starts to become difficult, we would just give up.
Yeah,
right?
These are all kind of barriers to entry that we have made it through, haven't we, if we become musicians?
Exactly. We have a great sensitivity to quality. And we're visionaries. You know, we have a sense of our potential. Okay, so I call them our 5 performance gifts. Each one of those gets adapted into something that is our blocks to our performance. Okay, so for instance, my attunement gets adapted into people pleasing. I become really aware of whether somebody approves or disapproves of what I'm doing, and I change what I'm doing and what I think should be done and what my taste in the music is and what my expression is in order to please others. Or it may be that it's important to be impressive, so I'm going to play really fancy stuff so that people think that I'm really great.
Yeah.
Right? And that comes right back to that attunement that we were talking about at the very beginning of our conversation.
Yeah.
Our constancy and discipline gets turned into trying too hard and becoming really overly focused. I'm not going to stop this until I've got it absolutely right. And so we're inherently creating tension in the body. You know, our resilience and determination turns into that I'm going to just push through, this kind of false strength of just pushing through and pushing through and pushing through, even though the whole system is saying stop for a moment, right? Our visionary part gets turned into, I can feel my potential, but I want to be that good now. So I hurry through. I want to get the results now. I want my dystonia to go away in 2 months, even though it's probably taken 30 years to develop. Then I want it to disappear in 2 or 3 months. So that kind of sense of being in a hurry. And then our our sensitivity to quality gets turned into our perfectionism. If I don't hit that absolute quality, then it's all awful and I'm awful and I'm not valid in any shape or form. So that's going on in the dystonia. Any combination of any or all of those is going on in the dystonia. Those are part of our mental and our emotional patterns.
Yeah.
That's really high leverage. When we start to be able to release all of that and come back into those pure gifts, then the fascia isn't holding on to anything any longer. And the fingers will, or the embouchure, or whichever part of the body we're working with, will be at peace too.
I'm sure I'm not accurately like mixing together things here as I say this, but I can't help thinking, like, speaking of like analogies and metaphors, right? That like as you describe the positive end of these 5 sticks, you know, I kind of go, yeah. Then you describe the negative end of the potential negative end of these 5 sticks. I go, oh yeah, that's yeah, that's true, isn't it? And it feels almost like Jungian in that like these are like the shadow side of what we're doing, and if we're not aware of it, of course we can't address it. And so like it's this how to become aware of it thing, right?
Right. And so we go right back to our self-attunement, the attunement repair.
Now, here's one thing that does, I don't want to, like, again, I don't want to stir up extra fear around this, you know, but I actually didn't know about this happening in sports. What do they call it? The yips?
The yips.
Or the yips. I didn't know. I'm so far removed from the world of sports. I had no idea, you know, until reading your book. And I went, oh, it shows up elsewhere, huh? And in your book, I think it might have been somebody else. Maybe it was in the introduction that somebody else wrote, but maybe it was parts that you wrote. That somebody talked about how, like, in baseball, there's this idea, like, you don't talk about it. Call it like the thing if you must, but like don't talk about it because you like conjure it into existence, right? But I couldn't help noticing that Victor Wooten, again Victor, right? He did say that once he had a name for it and like named it, before getting better, it got worse. Is something that he noticed. Is that a common experience, that when people like realize what it is, does it often get worse, or is that not everybody, just him?
It's certainly not everybody. It can happen. It's probably not even the most common experience. But I'm wondering whether, my thought is that that's just around the fear, because there's so much fear about, you know, focal dystonia, we'll go, right?
I mean, he said he was looking around forums, and so he maybe was then becoming aware of how bad it could get, or something like that, potentially.
Right. So when if we go back to the you were saying about why is it that it seems like there's no focal dystonia until the minute that somebody sits down at the piano.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's because the brain is associative, meaning that all the experiences that I have had in this same situation are all wired into that situation. Okay. So if I have many pressured experiences around playing my musical instrument, then every time I sit down at my musical instrument or I pick up my musical instrument, all those survival experiences are running through my body in relationship to the instrument. And I think it's very telling that if this person was sitting at a cheap piano where they didn't really have to perform, or an electric keyboard where there isn't so much pressure to perform, then there wasn't the nervous system wasn't in so much of a survival state. So, meaning that what's happened, that last domino, which is where it's the dystonia is presenting in the body in relationship to the instrument, that is always worse when the nervous system is more stressed. So I think that once there's this name on it and that name has so much fear around it, then my nervous system is more stressed, and therefore it looks like the dystonia, or the dystonia starts to present more significantly. But actually, I just think that's just a very superficial. It's just a superficial expression, and I don't mean superficial. I'm using that in terms of the depth of what's going on in the nervous system hasn't changed.
It didn't actually get worse.
It didn't actually get worse. Sometimes people... Go ahead.
Go ahead, Ruth. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say sometimes people do get the sense of things being worse as they bring their sensory gate down because they start to become aware. So whereas they thought it was just their ring finger that was curling inwards, they then start to be aware, well, actually, I've got a pain under my shoulder blade and I have a tightness in my diaphragm. And there's something weird that goes on in my foot at the same time. And I can notice how my jaw is clenched and my tongue is tense. And so then it suddenly can start to feel like it's worse and there's more going on. All that stuff's been going on already. It's just been out of our conscious awareness. And it's when we bring it into the consciousness and we do the brain spotting with it, that's when the nervous system can go, oh, that's a bit weird. I'm simplifying it, right? Reducing it down. But the basic nervous system goes, oh, that's really weird. Why would I be doing that? And it stops doing it.
Gotcha. That makes sense. I feel like I can imagine, and I don't want to at all like make light of serious medical diagnoses, right? You know, things like cancer and such. But I can imagine a potential situation where like you maybe had some sort of pain that led you to go to the doctor's office, but then once you have a diagnosis, you start to notice the aches that are all over your body, or you start thinking back and remembering, oh yeah, that one time I tried to lift that thing that hurt or something.
Yeah.
And so your awareness of it becomes bigger. And maybe what you're becoming aware of is very real manifestations of the situation. It's also possible that you become hyper aware and are seeing things where they're not, I would imagine. And I feel like focal dystonia, especially for someone who loves playing music, it's a really big deal. And so maybe that does happen for some of us, that like, especially if it's like this boogeyman we've heard of before and we're kind of scared of, and then somebody or some article or something makes us go, I might have that. Suddenly everything, you know.
And I think the important thing to remember is to not be scared of it. I mean, it's easy for me to say, right? But actually, I think there are two messages that I would really like to everybody to understand. And one is be aware for all of us as musicians. If we could become more aware of the way we hold survival in our body when we're playing our instrument, and we could come back to that freedom, we can come back to that beautiful end of those 5 gifts that I described. Then it doesn't matter whether, you know, this has nothing to do with focal dystonia. That's when music becomes deeply joyful. That's when I come home to where the music runs through my soul. And I think suffering in music in overall is so pronounced, you know, and so many of us as musicians are constantly suffering with something that is our soul, and that is probably as little children was just the most beautiful thing, that, you know, the one thing that I wanted to do in the whole of the day because it was my best moment. And then we've got to a point, like however many years down the line, where there's all this suffering involved in it. And so I think, you know, I would encourage people, just everybody, to really start to explore that and know that there doesn't need to be any suffering music. Music is pure, joyful, soulful expression. And that's where we want to be with it. And then if for whatever reason we have a block that is inhibiting our ability to perform, and focal dystonia is, as I say, one of the most pronounced of those blocks, certainly in the body, in terms of the body responding, it's a gift. Because it's your body going, I'm telling you to come home. So rather than being scared of it, we can listen to it as a message where we go, it's time for me to come home. And my body is guiding me.
So is there, I feel like it's not an uncommon thing for us to try to, I mean, like, it makes sense. It totally makes sense to me what you're saying. Like, being afraid of it, of course, that's going to increase that tension, right? I'd imagine that would just make things even worse. In the same way that, like, when we first notice that our fingers are getting lazy, like I've heard people say that it's like your fingers are moving underwater. You know, you notice things like that and you go, oh, I got to focus more on this, you know, and in that same way, your tension might go up. I can totally see how the attitude of like, attunement, right? Relaxing into
Mm,
it, like
mm,
kind of a kind of
mm,
acceptance can help to release that tension. So I
mm,
totally can see that. Of course, I worry for, and I'm sure I'd imagine that you have plenty of people who the road towards recovery is so long.
mm,
Maybe it even like Victor even talked about in that interview, and of course that was a few years ago.
mm,
He talked
mm,
about how like he's back to where he can play. He still, at least at that time, there was still he still had to be conscious of it and work at
mm,
it. And so
mm.
maybe that road stretches on longer than a person's lifetime, right? Maybe it's not 100% back to full recovery. Or am I being too cautious? Is that possible for all of us?
I think you're being cautious.
Hmm.
This is a conversation I had yesterday. I had a supervision session with one of the brain spotting therapists that works with
Hmm.
me that I've trained in this, and she was talking about one of the people that she's been working with Focal Dystonia. And this woman has an extraordinary painful life history,
Hmm.
you know, heartbreaking, really heartbreaking. And she has taken around about 40 sessions, brain spotting sessions with my colleague. So we're probably talking about that she's been working with this about a year and a half.
Hmm.
Okay. And she still has some of the dystonia. It's much less than it was, but she still has some of it.
Hmm.
And my colleague sort of, that was her view, this is a slow process.
Hmm.
And my reflection was, if you look at I can't remember how old this woman is. I think she's something like 45. 45 years of everything that's built up in her system, of all those experiences that she's had, and then how those have become embedded in each other, and that whole winding up that's happened inside of her.
Hmm.
A year and a half to be, I mean, emotionally, she's very free now. She has a lot more kind of personal strength and personality strength and feels well in herself. That's extraordinarily fast. I mean, I think that's light speed healing.
Yeah, if it can unwind that much faster than it wound up, that's a hopeful
Yeah,
picture,
yeah, yeah.
certainly.
And I think it's often, it's a reflection of, if we think of that hurry up, the visionary within us, and then that hurry,
Yeah,
wanting everything to come. We're in a society that wants to get everything sorted out yesterday
yeah,
and wants everything to happen really quickly. I think that's also partly a reflection of that. And I think we can
mm,
enter into a different paradigm here with our healing process and say, I'm taking a journey home to myself.
mm,
I've strayed such a long way from where my joy is. Why would I be in a hurry? Why don't I smell the roses on the way and
mm.
enjoy listening to the birds singing and really savor this journey home, because that I will develop so much wisdom.
Okay, that makes sense from some of the testimonials that I've read from people who have done work with you, and also people who have worked with, kind of tried to work on dystonia for years and years.
Mm,
In general, talking about how like there can be beautiful things that can come from it,
mm,
different ways of connecting to their music and things like that.
mm,
That's also a hopeful message.
mm,
And it seems to me like maybe that's useful if even if for no other reason than because it might contribute to helping a person relax,
mm, mm,
kind of
mm,
replace some of that fear with some kind of hope. Yeah.
mm, mm. I had, and this isn't an isolated moment. I had a Croatian client. So he was a toddler, a baby, and then, the first years of his life, 5 years of his life, he experienced the during the Balkan War,
Oh, yeah.
and then sort of towards the end of that, his father was reported missing, and
Mm.
on the front, it was, and his father actually wrote to me
Oh.
partway through the process, and his father said to me, "Thank you for returning my child back to me." because he had experienced, this beautiful toddler, this bright, wonderful child that became two-dimensional and grey because of the trauma. And that, his son came back. And I think maybe that's even more beautiful than that he could come back to playing his musical instrument.
Yeah. It's exciting to imagine how big some of the results or is ramifications the right word? Sort of how big the results can be.
Yeah.
That sounds lovely.
And it goes far beyond this. So I would say everyone that I work with ends up having a quality in their life, quality in their relationships, quality in their relationship with themselves, which for me is where at least half of the joy, if not more, comes from, as well as, seeing them coming back to their relationship to music.
Now, Ruth, I've already taken so much of your time. Do you have more time? Can I ask you more questions, or do you need to?
I'm fine for another. I'm fine for another 10, 15 minutes.
You're very kind. So I'm thinking of my anxiety for my friends, also my anxiety for myself. I'm just like watching for this to manifest. And maybe that's not wise of me, right? I shouldn't be that way. I shouldn't be thinking that way. But I like when you talked with Victor Wooten, he did talk about how like for a while I think he said he would play around it. When one finger wasn't working very well, he'd just find a way to comp. He said he started using his pinky instead of his ring finger up on the fret. He said down low, plucking his bass, he started using his thumb instead of his first two fingers. And that, I feel like, must be a pretty common thing for people to do. I know that I read of a violin player talked about how like he just started rescoring his lead sheets to not utilize the finger that was giving him trouble. When my friend Sean was experiencing it, one thing, our mutual friend Mike Swan came up with this idea that we would take a bagpipe chanter and we would we 3D printed one and put the hole that usually would be for the back thumb, we put it around in front of the chanter instead. So the pinky that usually didn't get used would now come into use. Basically, it would just reassign the fingers, right? Change them around. There's a really famous bagpiper, small pipe maker, Hamish Moore, who plays with his middle finger, his ring finger pulled off of the chanter, and pulls his pinky into use, which usually wouldn't be done. Which I feel I don't know, I feel almost guilty about it. I have a few like experimental instruments, like a high G bagpipe chanter that's so tiny, and a few high F whistles and stuff, that I do that same thing with my big fat fingers. I do non-consecutive digits to play. But I only do that for fun for myself or for recording jobs when I get like a gig that requires a recording with a high-pitched whistle. I don't have to, it's not like my only option, right, to hang on to my main instrument. And that's the situation for so many of these, my dear friends. My friend Heidi, who's a drummer, she's tried strapping her sticks into her hands because the grip disappeared, right? She couldn't get her hand to hold the stick anymore.
Yeah.
And I know that David Duncan, another bagpiper, would use, he tried using rubber bands to hold his hands in the right place, so then he could push against the rubber band to open up a hole, and then it would snap it back in place, So like, I feel like I don't want at all to be saying that like these people who I care about and respect are like doing it wrong or something like that, right? I feel like that's the natural thing we would do. We tried to address the issue where we see it. So do we then usually move backward from like when we're trying that, if that's not working, do we then move back to things like Botox injections and oral medications? And if that's not working, is that the path where we usually, I feel like we're like working our way back toward the root, but we're like slowly finding our way back that way to the root cause of focal dystonia through experimentation on our own. And maybe it's like more efficient to find an expert like yourself and like have you take me right to the root cause. You know what I mean? Is that, I guess, I'm sorry. I'm taking up all my time with you by talking. It's because I'm nervous, but is that what you usually see with your people you work with? I mean, have they usually been trying to play around it? Is that a common thing?
It is very common, and it's completely understandable. I mean, it's quite a difficult until I start explaining some of the science behind this, it's actually quite difficult to understand that what's going on with my finger curling in or my finger pushing out or the corners of my lips collapsing or my tongue coming upwards and backwards instead of forwards. It's quite difficult to think that that could have something to do with my early life history. Right?
Yeah. Oh, it was weird to me when you, yeah, for sure.
It's a really big jump to take, you know, also then within our Cartesian kind of thought process of our society, of course, the normal thing would be to do is I've got a problem in my fingers. I need to fix the problem in my fingers.
Yeah.
Right. And find fixes for that. But of course, we're not getting to the cause there. So it's like putting a sticking plaster on all the time, but we're not actually healing. I will often talk, because I work with a lot of musicians who are working musicians, so they can't stop playing whilst we go through our process. They need to continue with their playing.
There's a complicating factor, yeah.
Right. So what I will very often talk to them is about to create two spaces inside of their mind in terms of their relationship to the instrument. We have our healing space, and in our healing space, we're not going to put that much attention onto where the dystonia is presenting itself. We're actually trying to come more into this whole pattern of being and the whole pattern of survival that the person is holding and release that. Okay. So that's one space, but they also can have this other space in their life, which is about being functional on the instrument. And within that space, it is completely appropriate for them to do whatever they need to do in order to be functional. And
so rubber bands or Botox or whatever it is, switch your fingers,
whatever's needed, and it's and they're not going to interfere. You know that functionality is not going to interfere with the work that we're doing.
I see. So you can still work on treatment while playing around it, as it could be described.
Yeah.
I wonder if you would find this case interesting, Ruth. There's a famous bagpiper named Chris Apps who makes reeds. He's one of my favorite reed makers. I have a bunch of Apps reeds in a box behind me right now. And he talks about how he had the experience of focal dystonia, and he, it sounds like, to hear him talking about it, he very much through experimentation across many years kind of found a way to get over it himself, you know? And what he talked about doing was he would also, like his issue was like when he was trying to use his ring finger, his middle finger would also move along with it. And he found that I think what he was doing was strapping his middle finger down. And he said that, and it's interesting to hear him talk about it and just having read your book and thinking about the way that you approach it, because I don't mean to be speaking for Chris Apps at all here, right? This is just me like kind of connecting dots here. He talked about how, he said, this is how I visualize it in my mind, right? He said he would like separate these things in his head, strap down that middle finger, work with the ring finger. And he said that after many years of work, he got to where he could unstrap the middle finger and play again. But I thought this was interesting. He said, as long as he could stay relaxed.
There you go.
Right? And that sounds like what you're getting at, right? It's a relaxation thing. That's maybe the key thing there, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. So and it's more than just being relaxed. If I'm centered in myself, I'm not out of myself. I'm not in any of those adaptations. I'm really centered in myself, in this place of real that I'm safe with myself and I'm strong enough to be safe in the world as a result. So that's what we're looking for. Okay, so it's not a kind of relaxation as in I can meditate and I can relax my body, but actually all my patterns are still the same. Yeah. That's the fundamental part. But there is this other part that happens on, and that's sort of they're the very last exercises in the book, but they do require this centeredness first in order to get to them. And that is where, as part of that, because the sensory gates come up so high, we've become dissociated, our brain actually hasn't been able to accurately feel what's going on in the body. So the map has often got very blurred.
Yeah. I've heard people talk about their experience with it, talking about how like that point of contact, whether it's for their embouchure, you know, to tighten up, or for their fingers on keys or on holes or whatever it is, strings, that they realized that their sensitivity was gone. It was like they couldn't feel that spot anymore.
Right. So we can do some brain sort of at the end of the process. If some of that is still going on, then we can do some brain spotting around And it might be about feeling the ergonomic simplicity of the body, where I might be having my hand at the wrong angle or over trying, so I come back into feeling that ergonomic flow and connection to the instrument. And then there is something about being able to really feel the tips of the fingers and be able to distinguish between what's happening in my ring finger and what's happening with my middle finger, for instance. There's a very common place for the map to get blurred together because they are connected together in the brain in a way that the other fingers aren't. And that's also, for some people, that is part of the process. I think the difficulty is when they try to do that before the nervous system is in well-being, then what they're doing is, as I said before, they're pushing the door from the side of the hinges.
Yeah. Is it always the ring finger, Ruth?
No.
I just feel like it can't be, right? It seems to come up often, like on fretboards and stuff like that, but it's not only the ring finger, right?
No, it is, but it is very frequent.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Just because we don't have a strong neural connection, separate neural connection into the ring finger as we do with the other fingers.
So maybe it's kind of like the fascia is tight everywhere, but that's maybe a common spot for it to show up first and most severely, or something like that.
There's a sort of a predisposed tendency in the body for, I don't want to say weakness because it's not, but there is this sort of, as a flautist, we're obsessed with our ring fingers because on the right hand, we have to keep our little finger, our pinky stays down on a key, and this has to move independently. Now you try to do that to move, to try to move your ring finger independently and keeping your middle finger and your pinky down is actually very difficult. So we do a lot of training so that the brain can really create very strong neural connections into that fine motor skill. So because that requires extra work, because there isn't a natural ability in the brain for that, particularly if we've been somebody who rushed through our practicing as a young person. I wanted to play really quickly, so I rushed through and I didn't develop enough interoceptive sensitivity into that movement into my ring finger. Then there's going to be a sort of natural weakness in inverted commas. If it's going to come out somewhere, it's more likely to come out there.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah. I wonder if that's even part of, it feels like the left ring finger often comes up. And I had wondered if that was because that's often what's on the frets for a string player. But then like with bagpipers, that's on the top hand, but there's no reason why the top hand versus bottom hand that I can think of would be all that different. But if most of us are right-handed, then maybe even between the two ring fingers, it's the left one that's going to show up first.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. So I want to make sure everybody knows that, of course, you've got your Focal Dystonia book already out. And very exciting. You have a new book coming out. I'll make sure there are links to both, to your website, your YouTube channel, all in the show notes.
Great. We have a learning community on Facebook. So for anybody who's listening who is struggling with Focal Dystonia, it's a fantastic place to ask questions. I've been doing this part of the book. I've been doing this exercise. I'm not sure whether I'm doing it right. So they can get a lot of guidance through the learning community on the Facebook page. So it'd be great if we can have that link as well into the...
Absolutely. I'll put that link in there as well. And I want you to have the opportunity to kind of close out gracefully. If you want, I could try asking you a question to answer. And if it's not a good question, we can throw it out. Or if you have kind of a statement you like to make, that's okay too.
Let's go for the question. And if that doesn't work, then I will... I do have something to hand that I can close on.
Yeah, perfect. With full power to you. If this doesn't feel quite right, that's fine. And maybe this is me being overly worried yet again, Ruth, but I wonder if, precisely because of the 5 gifts that you talked about that musicians have, if maybe there's an impediment for someone who might be experiencing focal dystonia. And again, I'm not trying to say that my dear friends are not like trying. Obviously they are, like I'm not trying to say, oh, you're doing it wrong. You should have done it better. Nothing like that, right? But I'm imagining for me, if I were to encounter an explanation for what was going on with my fingers that isn't what I thought it was, and I've put years into working on my fingers, and there's a lot of stuff built up in that. And if part of it might on the surface seem to even suggest to me that I'm like not tuned, like that I'm not in touch with myself, that I'm not sensitive in some way, that might feel really, I might get defensive, I think.
Okay.
That's
Yeah.
just me. But those are things that I would value as a musician. I would think of myself as in tune and sensitive and things like that. Sensitive to art and sensitive to emotion and all this kind of stuff. So, how could I, in that situation, maybe be helped to get over that defensiveness and kind of give this thing a chance at least?
Well, I think there are two parts to my answer. One is that what we're gating out that is profound wisdom in our nervous system, because they are things that are too painful. So my nervous system is being really intelligent to gate that information out for me. And part of the process that we go through is about building resilience into the system so that that information can start coming back in. So I think it's really important in all of this process to be really kind to ourselves. Everything that my system is doing, it's being extraordinarily intelligent in doing it. It's not doing it wrong. One of the things that people hear me say over and over and again, just be present with what is and know that this is intelligent, even if it's painful. And so we start to invite everything in and stop rejecting ourselves and actually start going, yeah, I really want to listen to you. I want to listen to this experience that's happening inside of me, even though sometimes they are painful.
Oh, I feel like, was it in your book that somebody talked about observing instead of controlling?
Yeah. And I think part of the defensiveness sometimes also is that we do have an intuition around the pain that we are holding inside. And there is almost like and there's naturally a reticence to go there. It's like, if I could heal this without having to walk into that room inside of me, I would prefer to do it that way. And that's also completely understandable and completely valid.
I don't think I'd understood before, Ruth, as you described this. Maybe it makes more sense to me now that a lot of, maybe all of that might be going on in that not conscious part of my brain. Right. And so I'm convinced that I'm fine, right? But yes, there's maybe something back here that's going, you got to examine this. And I don't even realize that I need to look at it because it's not rising to that part of my brain.
Right. And that's where the dystonia is a gift, because it's saying, I'm asking you to pay attention to something that's difficult to pay attention to. So let me also round off with what I was thinking, which is a quote from the 17th century Sufi called Niazi Misri. And he wrote, I was seeking a cure for my trouble. My trouble became my cure. And that's why I call the book The Focal Dystonia Cure, not because we're curing your focal dystonia, but because your focal dystonia is curing you.
Oh, I didn't catch that before.